Hello everyone, thank you for coming to the Politico pub. That was the division bell, which means that we are now live online. I'm Dan Bloom, political editor in the UK for Politico, and I'm very pleased to be joined by the Chief Whip, Jonathan Reynolds. Thank you. Yeah, you can do that.
I think Chief Whips don't get many rounds of applause. That's quite a nice start.
And even better, he has actually got a pint of beer, which I think he's the first speaker brave enough to do that, so thanks. This is pretty rare, an interview with the Chief Whip. How did you persuade Number 10 to let you do this?
Well, I just asked the Chief Whip.
Did you?
Then I decided to give myself permission. I can't be reported to anyone, can I? Partly down it was because we'd already booked this in. I didn't want to let you down, and I'm pretty impressed with this pub you've got here, which is very nice. And I thought, look, I might want to maybe do the job in a different way. I don't think you necessarily have to do a job like it was in the 18th century, even though we kind of like that in British politics, so we can look at that in a different way. And I think, look, you clearly, in a job like this, you're moving from running your own bit of the show to being, in the centre in a team of people. I spend a lot of time with the Prime Minister, obviously having now Number 9 Downing Street next door. The front door's not as good, but the office is quite nice. And I think, look, I'd like to maybe be a Chief Whip who obviously does the job, gets our legislation through Parliament, works with my colleagues to do that. But I think also there is a need to sort of explain about the decisions we need to make in government, some of the trade-offs we need to make within there. And I think if you treat people well and explain the choices, they understand those.
So you'd like to speak publicly a bit more. You don't want to be in the shadows.
Well, it's clearly a bit more behind the scenes, right? I mean, that's there's no doubt about that. But I mean, the good bits of the job, I start the day with the Prime Minister every day. We have quite a bit of time together before Cabinet and on Mondays, where you can look ahead. You can include yourself in any bit of legislation or political issue that you think is important and your colleagues need to be aware of. I think you can use that well, and I think there is a need for more people to sort of they want insight into how things are being made, not how the sausage is being entirely constructed, but some of the decisions that have been behind those.
So you're now the sounding board for, 350, 400 of your colleagues. What are they telling you?
They're all really happy.
Are they?
Really happy with the new Chief Whip. That's a very strong message coming out. I mean, look, I think we take the year and a bit the new Labour government's had. I think, look, I used to think of the things I did in DBT, the big calls we made, openness to trade, the 3 trade deals, the interventions on industrial policy, energy costs coming down, skills, finance. I think the work we did on Holland and Wolff or British Steel, really, really important. And then I add in on, across the board, I look at what happened with, the free school meals or defence spending. I think we've made a lot of the right calls, I really do. Now, have we told a story which is the sum of those parts and what links them together? I think, there's more to do on that side. And I think colleagues want a lot of that to sort of, be consistent and improved, frankly, in the second year going forward. But, what I really like about this conference, you'll have seen this in the Prime Minister's interview on Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg, is it's a much more assertive articulation of the choice the country's facing. And I do honestly believe it's a choice between, look, there are problems in the UK and the public want them solved, and I get that. We get that and we want to fix them. Or do you want a political party in reform that will basically use those problems for its own ends, its own divisiveness, has no real interest in fixing illegal immigration or small boats or anything like that. And I think that people want that choice in the parliamentary party. They want that choice put to the public and be more assertive about that.
So that's kind of the message to the public. In terms of dealing with the MPs, which is obviously a lot of what you're going to be doing now, how are you hoping to do that engagement differently? Where have things gone wrong before?
Well, I think, first of all, there are things we perhaps always thought were coming that we haven't really resolved. I mean, it's a huge parliamentary party. 400 MPs, at least, is a lot of people. And I think it's quite hard sometimes for people to feel that they can make the contribution they want. I mean, to me, everyone can make a contribution. They won't all be on the front bench or the government. They select committees, a whole range of roles. We need to find and get that right for people. Look, I always say there's no point any of us, going on the media and saying it's hard being an MP because, look, our constituents' lives are hard and they aren't, appreciative of us saying that. But it is a tough time in the sense of I can't think of a previous era where a member of parliament or a councillor even has faced the kind of pressures they face in terms of people's expectations and the general political environment. It has deteriorated a lot in the 15 years I've been an MP. And that is difficult. If you're a new MP and you're now, you've been doing something, perhaps weren't even expecting, in some cases, to get elected for your seat. And all of a sudden, you're responsible for the entire government in your area. That's tough. I do understand that and recognise that. But I've always liked, I like my colleagues. I like being in a tea room. I like talking to them. I loved the year at Business and Trade. I was fascinated by those issues and what we did. But I do care about our colleagues. I think, look, any government, if you cannot get your programme through, if you can't deliver upon that programme, if you can't show that we can make difficult decisions, and you have to make, that's what government is, right, difficult decisions, you won't achieve the change that people want to see. So we need to be one team. Everyone's got to play a role. We've got to respect and engage people.
The biggest one, though, was welfare cuts in the summer. I mean, MPs just would not stomach that, a very sizable number of MPs. So you're going to, at some point, the government is going to come back again and is going to want to do welfare cuts again, or welfare reform, or a bit of both. What are you going to do differently? How are you going to be the man who gets that through?
Well, let's just be clear about this, right? We were not talking about cutting spending on welfare. We were talking about it growing less fast than the projected very large increase, but it was still going to go up by billions of pounds.
Cutting entitlement.
Well, I think, look, I mean, you cannot simply spend as much money on everything as everybody wants.
But how are you going to persuade MPs?
Well, I think if you ask people, do you recognise there's got to be spending restraint in some areas, that we can't spend all the money we want on everything, that actually there are some areas where, particularly what's happened after the pandemic on out-of-work benefits, it's an incredible increase in the last Parliament. Do they recognise that's something we've got to look at, not just from a public finances point of view? I mean, look, my son is extremely, high needs. He receives PIP as well as universal credit. If we want to protect the most vulnerable people, we've got to look at, what is the overall spend and entitlement. We've got to keep the public on board with that. So people accept that case. I think everyone would recognise that was not done in a way that took people with us. That's why we had to have the changes, and those were important decisions that were necessary for the parliamentary party going forward. So we have to do those things better. But is it necessary as a government to say, look, there'll be difficult decisions, that the kind of, is it possible to have the kind of market confidence the country with our level of indebtedness needs, and a compelling political story and delivery of people's priorities? Yes, you can do all that. I really believe you can do all that.
Yeah, you brought up your son there. Were you kind of personally worried about or against the PIP changes that were originally proposed?
No doubt. I mean, I said, I think on the media at the time, that I genuinely worry that there's an argument I don't think was surfaced enough in that, which is, look, the sheer increase in, for instance, entitlement to PIP, the recipients of that, and look, there are people with conditions that absolutely believe they should be given support, but the level of increase that we've seen, I think genuinely risks the support we need to give to the most vulnerable people. I think this wasn't a case between kind of, the wanting to support vulnerable people and the pressures on the public finances. I do think we've got a reasonable argument about what I have seen since the pandemic in terms of the increase in that, the levels of people out of work. Are we supporting people in the right way? I don't think for everyone who has real needs, just paying them cash benefits and them not being in work is the right thing. So I felt there wasn't a sufficient recognition of perhaps my family's situation, which is, I absolutely want to protect the most vulnerable people in this country, but I need public support for the system to do that. And that public support will not be there if we aren't making sure that we're running that in a good way.
I'll just ask one more about this. There were 4 MPs that were suspended for what was called at the time persistent knobheadery. You had Neil Duncan Jordan.
That was an official quote.
No, and I think it was under your predecessor. But Chris Hinchliffe, Neil Duncan Jordan, Rachel Maskell, Brian Leishman. What's the process? How are they going to be allowed back? Are they going to be allowed back?
Well, look, those are situations I have inherited. I've said to all those colleagues who've asked, I'll need to talk to them early on when Parliament is returning after the conference recess. The question I would have for any colleague is, do you want to be a Labour MP? Do you want to be part of this team? I hope they do. I hope they want to work with us. But, people who are members of Parliament, of course, their job is to represent their constituents, right? That's what I want them to do. But I do need people to recognise it is not, unreasonable or unfair or unknowable that if we're going to deliver for the change that people elected this Labour government to deliver, people have got to work in a team. 400 people as freelancers would not deliver very much. You have no health service if we'd done that after the war, right? So I need people to recognise, yes, I want them to be strong advocates for their area, make those decisions, vote in that way. But for any colleague, I'm talking for anyone in the parliamentary party, are they aware that we've got to do this cohesively together to do it? And that's important to me too.
I've got a very important question for you. What's your most sinister pet? Do you have a tarantula? You're going to get one. Yeah.
My favourite ever, unsourced, unattributed quote from a politician relates to Sir Gavin Williamson, and the tarantula story, which people have raised a lot. And I just want to say at this point, when you walk into number 9 Downing Street, I don't know who it was, but some people have left actual whips there, right? So there are some riding whips.
Have you used one in anger?
I didn't know what a riding whip was, right? But I remember this is why the quote is so brilliant. I think you might have even written it down, I can't remember, but one of the Tory MPs said something like this, which was, when a man keeps a tarantula on his desk, it is simply because he has no better story to tell. And I think that is the sort of thing. So I don't see myself doing that. I think it'd be a different approach.
It's a shame. It's much more fun for the journalists.
I wonder who fed it when he was in his constituency.
What's you sit on the front bench, don't you now? Like, all the time. It's
the chief whip has a reserved seat before the gangway. Yeah, so you're on camera a lot.
So you now get all the Tory insults fired at you, don't you? What's the worst one you've heard so far?
Oh, honestly, this lot of Tories are not very good at that. Yeah.
Sweary?
They're not very gritty. I mean...
what about from behind you?
Yeah. They're just like, chief. People do call you chief. I mean, I couldn't get... I'm not saying I tried it much, but, when you're the business secretary, your other title is President of the Board of Trade. And President did not catch on as a title in the Parliamentary Party. The President seemed to be somebody else in the trade agenda. But look, I mean, one thing people really, I think, never quite understand is it's like Parliament's a brilliant place. House of Commons is a brilliant place to speak in because the wonderful chamber rebuilt after the war when it was destroyed. It's wooden panelled, the microphones pick up your voice, it's great. But the microphones are so efficient. They don't pick up the insults, right? And so it looks like you're doing a very statesman-like speech on the dispatch box, and people are shouting like, you bastard Reynolds, which is a unique experience, I think, that a lot of international colleagues don't quite appreciate. But no, I mean, look, I looked across when I was business secretary at the Tory benches. I don't mean this like in an arrogant way, but like I feel a sense of genuine pity for them because I know how hard it is to be a shadow minister. I understand the Tories have far less support because of their relative lower numbers than we had pre the election. Look, I just know how hard it is when a department like Business and Trade alone was one week we had, I think, 3 or 4 important statements because the steel stuff, the trade stuff was contemporary, the post office, industrial strategy. You might have a big industrial issue, which is an urgent question. And I can see them struggling to respond to that. And of course, at the same time, which is very unique to this situation, the conversation in the country is essentially Labour and Reform, but in Parliament they're the official opposition. I mean, that isn't easy for them, to be honest. We should recognise that.
Just on a quick serious note, though, that a lot of what we've heard from MPs is that there's a lot of distrust of the new Whip's office. They basically see it as kind of people who are very in, not yourself necessarily, but some of the Whips are people who are very in with number 10. MPs even complain about people having, basically family links to people in number 10. So the question is, can they trust you? How can you reassure them that they can trust you?
Well, look, I'd be pretty robust on this, and I saw that the quote in the Politico newsletter, which of course I start
and elsewhere, yeah.
my day with. But I mean, look, the Whip's office is a government department, right? Now that's a Whip's office in terms of how it needs to work. It needs a strong relationship with the centre, with Downing Street. That's why I start my day every day with the Prime Minister and have that access to him. But equally, when people come in and they've got issues, they need to work with us. We do that, but you are coming into a government department. It is a part of government. I mean, would anyone say, they're worried the Treasury is aligned with number 10? I mean, that's exactly what should happen, right? And so I would push back a little bit on the idea that we're just there to hear a range of complaints and not seek to use that in a way which then has a cohesive collective platform. And on people personally, I would just say, I think it should be okay to ask people to be treated on their own merits and their own skills. Every single one of those people in the Whip's office has an incredible political career already behind them. If people are complaining that people might be married to someone, well, look, my wife's a political professional herself, and I've had some experience of that. I think we should all be able to say, can we not be judged on our own merits and skills? And I would absolutely, ask anyone to challenge the credentials of any of my Whips, because they're all, I think, an incredible team of people recognised for their abilities and brought into a whip's office to do a job which is essential to delivering on the government's agenda.
I just want to ask you briefly about your old job. You spent a long time dealing with Team Trump over trade. Apart from getting a call when you were halfway over the Pennines over some text, which I think is a story you've told before, what's the strangest thing that happened to you during your time dealing with the White House?
I mean, I'm not going to answer that till I'm retired several decades into the future, Dan. But I mean, look, the big decision was always got to be, do we engage in what is a very assertive US first agenda? I honestly think the government has been validated entirely on its decision to engage. We have the best terms of trade with the US of any comparable country. We've saved tens of thousands of jobs, and I would sit in Parliament. I'd be on the dispatch box, and even the Liberal Democrats, quite a mellow bunch of people, would be like, let's refuse to talk to the United States. And you're like, yeah, you can say that for the opposition. That's not serious, right? The defence of this country, our economy, thousands of jobs depend on that relationship. Our decision to engage with them, I mean, they're interesting people, and there's not always an alignment between the USTR, the US Trade Representative's Office, and their Commerce Department. I mean, we would never have any differences between government departments in the UK, would we? We're all, completely aligned at all times on that. Sure. But, it has been challenging. I mean, the decision to go ahead with the sectoral tariffs, so the aerospace, automotive tariffs that were so important to us, the value of our exports to the US that covered was absolutely phenomenal. And we had to give the US some things, the beef and ethanol liberalisation, but, on beef that's reciprocal. We gained something tremendous in terms of our market access to the US. And I think, again, you look at that, what are the really big things this government's had to look at in its first year of office? On things like that, I really do believe we got it right.
Steel tariffs, should we kind of give up hope of them coming down below 25% now?
Well, as I understand it, I mean, where that had got to was there was an offer from the US on a quota for a zero tariff quota, but the offer was essentially not sufficient to justify moving away from having a 25% tariff.
What was the condition? What was the problem?
I'm not going to tell you some of that, Dan. But I mean, it's effectively, let's not forget we have a better deal again than any other comparable country. 25% compared to 50% in most places. So objectively, that was better around that. I mean, I'd say to any US friend, any US colleague, I understand again their agenda around good jobs in the US. Our construction steel industry in the UK, in the main, in the supply chain for the US, it is in the supply chain. So effectively, you're making your own products more expensive on global markets if you charge a tariff on UK steel. We have an incredibly close relationship on defence steel. I mean, part of the US submarine program is supplied by some very specific UK products, and I think that is zero tariff rate. And so it's a complex relationship. But again, understanding where the US is coming from, we have, I think, worked within there to not get everything that we want. They haven't got everything that they want, by the way, as part of that either. But absolutely the right thing to do to work with them. Just
listening to you, you clearly cared so much about this job, and you felt you were doing, a lot of good. I just feel it must be quite gutting to be taken out of that job. I know you're loyal to the PM. I know you care about the project, but in here, how's it feel?
I mean, look, it's politics, right? I lived every minute at business and trade. I'm personally interested in the relationship between business, markets, geopolitics, politics. Yeah, I mean, this I think is what really determines a lot of the things that really matter. And I love talking to businesses. I'm just fascinated by that. I mean, I just say to people, even in opposition, even when Labour wasn't anywhere near government, if you can go and talk to any business in the UK, that's pretty great, right? So I did love it, and the trade stuff became very, very prominent. But look, I mean, I want this Labour government to work, and the Prime Minister was very kind. He said he needed someone very close to him who also the PLP would recognise and respond to in the role of Chief Whip. And, and the Prime Minister rings you up and asks you to do a job, you've got to do that. And I think, look, the role you get, as I say, is... Dan, the bit I'd say honestly is I would rather be the manager of Sunderland than the assistant manager of Man City, and that's not just because I'm a Sunderland fan. So you're going from running your bit of it to being a key part of the centre. So it's a little bit different in that regard. But again, any policy issue, any issue of concern to the parliamentary party, the access you have to the Prime Minister, I do think right now for the UK, I think it's going into the budget, understanding the business community and the trade position the UK is in and the relative fiscal challenges of that, is essential to the success of the government. So it's not like you're giving up your relationships and access to that point.
So I appreciate, you've gone from jet setting around the world to this quite dingy office with these quite horrible sofas apparently in it, in the Commons, all the rest. I mean, you have been moved into that job. It sounds like that you wouldn't put it this way, but to save Keir Starmer and save the government. Can you do it?
I think it's about delivering on the government's programme, okay? And clearly managing a parliamentary party of this size is a challenge. There's no doubt about that. Doing it in the current political environment is a challenge. So, look, I mean, Alan Campbell, by the way, is a great friend of mine. I was a whip when he was our deputy chief whip. He's done a terrific job and doing a different role now as leader of the Commons. But, the point about like how you put forward a King's Speech, how you have the second session legislation, how we make that cohesive, how do we tackle difficult issues, talk to the public, talk to MPs around it. It is a specific job. And look, I think it's a chance, to be honest, as well, to, as you said at the beginning, Dan, you don't have to do a job in British politics like it was been done by everyone else. I think there is an idea here to maybe do it in a different way. And I find that quite exciting. But look, I think in terms of colleagues, what do they really want? They want the government to succeed. They want the government to succeed. And I think they, that is clear in everything that they do. It's not about, what is the future of the government in that sense. It's about how can we feel that they're able to contribute to the degree that they want.
But are any MPs telling you, or your whips, May's the last chance salute?
No. I mean, look, local elections, midterm elections, a very significant set, particularly with the Scottish and Welsh elections, are always going to be a big deal. But, what colleagues want is the government working in a way that maximises our chances, which I think are significant, of success in those elections.
You're a big friend of Andy Burnham, I think, predating this week, I hasten to add. What's he done? Has he overstretched himself here?
I was feeling you might mention this, Dan. I don't know. Look, so Andy is a friend of mine, and I think he's done a terrific job. As somebody who lives and represents Greater Manchester, I think he's done a terrific job as mayor. I do know him way back from before I was an MP and worked for an MP and knew Andy from Parliament, and I am really impressed by how he, as a person, as mayor, has been able to express himself in that way. At the same time, I'm a very close friend of the Prime Minister, and I've said repeatedly, I think there would be no Labour government if we hadn't changed the Labour Party, and Keir was essential to that. And then he won the election, and that deserves recognition as well. And look, there's a lot of work to do to turn this country around and give it what people want it to be. Everyone can play a role in that, and that's both from our mayors and our cabinet and Prime Minister. So look, for me, it's quite happy to say I think everyone has an essential role in that.
I was going to say the last question, really. Like, you obviously have a huge amount of loyalty and respect for the Prime Minister. Does it frustrate you? Why do you think it is that a lot of the public, shall we say, if you look at the polling, doesn't seem to be able to see what you see? Like, what's the disconnect?
That's interesting. I mean, I do know him, I think, pretty well. Certainly, one of the most in the cabinet. And I know what drives him, I know what motivates him. I think, he represents something we haven't had enough of in the UK. He's a genuine working class guy, done well, and then taking that success into politics and using that as the base. He could have had an easier life than being Prime Minister, there's no doubt about that, but he got involved, rolled his sleeves up, and we really needed him. We really need a leader like Keir after the election defeat in 2019 to do that. And look, I mean, with many of my friends, I'm very close friends with a lot of the cabinet. For some of them, I think it's harder than others, maybe to get across who they really are, and that is worth thinking about. But I also think, the kind of environment we're in now, guys, which is like, sometimes one thing's very different today to even 5 years ago is you can knock on a door and talk to someone, and it's not like they've got different political views to you, which you understand are coming from a kind of centre-right or right-wing place. Sometimes you realise they're exposed to media political influences so beyond the mainstream that we as a party are not quite in that space, and they're being motivated by things that they've seen. I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is, to be honest, but I absolutely have no doubt in saying, in terms of the credentials, the expertise, the personal motivation, this is a Prime Minister the whole country could be proud of, definitely.
I've got some quick fire questions for you, and then we'll go to the roving mic.
Okay.
So prepare your questions, everyone, please. Carrot or stick?
Carrot.
Change or renewal?
Change.
Do you know what the difference is between?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. It's actually just gone to a thesaurus and did it. Yeah, look, I think country wants change.
Noel or Liam?
I always felt Noel was, the genius behind it all.
Angela Rayner or Andy Burnham?
Both very close friends.
And DBT or the Whip's office?
Both brilliant jobs.
Excellent. Okay. Right, let's take some questions if people are up for it. Come on, so we've got one over here from Mason.
Following the Hartlepool by-election defeat, it was reported that Keir Starmer kind of wanted to resign, and it was his close aides and confidants that stopped him from doing that. Given you're so close with the Prime Minister, now potentially more than ever, has he confided any doubts that he is the right man for the job at the moment, or any doubts of how much cut-through he's having? Like, what are the doubts that you hear from him?
No, look, I mean, I do spend a lot of time with the Prime Minister. I think he has been, certainly in the last few weeks, incredibly resolved on the difference the government needs to make to people's lives to make that difference. I don't want to sound like I'm giving you a line, but any sense of what you're suggesting is just not there. This is someone genuinely resolved to make the difference and keen to make the argument that if you want the problems that people are frustrated about in this country sorted out, it's going to be this government that delivers them. And frankly, no one else is even on the pitch when it comes to that. So I like that. I thought that the tone in the Sunday media interviews was assertive, was clear on the difference that we need to make and the choices available to the country.
I think he's still got as much fight in him as he had 15 months ago.
Yeah, more.
And he's absolutely going to go to the next
election.
election.
Look, we've all come in and learned. It's quite. I mean, one thing I always felt as a Secretary of State is it's quite unusual when you're coming in as a Secretary of State, because usually be a junior minister and move up, right? So and there are things where I think the system has been incredible. I thought the weekend we recalled Parliament passed emergency legislation to save the steel industry was just an incredible bit of statecraft in the UK. There are other things where we're all a bit frustrated how slow it is to make things happen, right? And you learn how that system works. And I think a Prime Minister in Keir's position has done some great things, but recognises, where you need that system to move more quickly. And that's why you become more resolved in the job.
All right, let's take another question. We've got the lady at the front here.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you about skills. It was in Department for Education, it's now in DWP, it could have gone to DBT. It's relevant to so many of the government's agendas. And you also mentioned earlier in the context of PIP that you don't want to just give people money. You've got to have something else. So what would you have done if you were still at DBT on skills? And what are you going to do now to join up this issue across government?
Look, I mean, the reason I have always had an interest in it is it's going to be the number one issue for any business, right? Have you got the talent? Have you got people coming in? Is the system working in the way you need it to? I think this country has never really got the skills system right. I think you can go back 100 years to a conference if it wouldn't be in a pub like this, but people would be talking perhaps about the skills challenge. If you look what we did in the industrial strategy, which was, it wasn't rocket science. We put additional funding packages in to the kind of courses like engineering, where they're more expensive to put on, and therefore you need more finance in the system to do that. More flexibility from the business side around the levy. I mean, the big challenge is this, and we'd all recognise this across government, is when the apprenticeship levy was brought in, a very strong argument it was to stop, essentially freeloading that all businesses would pay towards it. Now, since that happened, and it's quite an interesting policy for a non-Labour government to introduce, as a coalition, I think. The overall business spend on skills in the UK has gone down. So that's not how anyone would have envisaged, I think, that turning out. You have businesses who are putting a lot of money into brilliant skills programs, but they're kind of paying that on top of the levy. So it needs a look at in that way. The reason I think the business voice is so important in that is we can do all the supply side reform we want, but businesses need to take people on. So you've got to listen to them. And how we put that voice into the system, I think, is important. But I also think the Department for Education, schools have to be the number one priority. You just can't expect anything else. I think what has happened with Pat taking over some of that and Skills England in working pensions is really, really interesting. And I would imagine Peter and Pat working really closely together to make sure the business voice is part of that. But, again, it requires businesses having a bit more flexibility over some of those funds, however you do it. More capacity in the actual quality of the courses. Some are more expensive, more money needs to go into that. On things like defence spending, of course, part of that has to be on the skills supply chain. That's not just some people have good careers, but that is a strategic need as a country to have the skills base to do that. That's what it's got to be about. And look, I, from business in particular, tremendous appetite to engage in that conversation. Now, I think the Industrial Strategy Council is going to continue that work, and it'll work slightly differently with working pensions now, but it's essential to getting it right.
Got another question here, and then I can see Kevin Maguire from the Mirror bobbing in the corner. So we'll go.
You said at the start it was going to be more kind of, you were going to do things slightly differently as Chief Whip. Does that mean that sort of the little black book is going to be consigned to history? Is it more pastoral over punitive, or are you still going to be able to crack the proverbial whip?
Well, look, when I say I'm going to do it differently, I mean, I've not run this past anyone, but I see him as Chief Whip, I can just make that decision unilaterally. There's no little black book handed down. I mean, I don't know how risque I want to be here, but I'd say, look, the problem these days is not you have to have someone's secrets. It's like they might voluntarily put something on the internet that is more difficult to deal with. And look, I think, go back a few decades, right? If you wanted to be someone gaining recognition in Parliament, you would need journalists to write up the speech that you made. There wasn't even TV cameras at one point to cover that. You had the Whip's office controlled not just the front bench, but even who was on select committees. All that's gone. Right? If Dan here was an MP and I wasn't happy with him and I was quite mean to you, I might threaten you. I wouldn't really, but if I did, right, you'd probably just tweet that and become immediately invited on the television news, right? So like the levers are different, and I do think fundamentally, you treat people well as a starting point. Only a strange type of personality reacts badly to that, but I think we've got to recognise that. And look, I need all my colleagues to, going back to that point, we will achieve nothing unless we work as one team. But how do people feel they're part of that team? I think that's the answer to that question. And on how a Chief Whip operates, I think, look, my personal feeling is people want to know a bit more about how decisions are made, the trade-offs that were there. Once you're doing that conversation on a doorstep because they've seen the national news, and you say, well, look, we could have gone in that direction, but these were the trade-offs of that decision. And they're like, oh yeah, I get that, right? And I feel we could just articulate that a bit better. And going back to that point, a lot of British politics works on people doing what their predecessor did, and it just goes back and back and back. There's a chance maybe at times to think about how can we do this differently. That's what it's about.
I think this will have to be our last question because we're nearly out of time.
What do you think Peter Kyle will do differently to you? I'm thinking particularly employment rights, because Angela Rayner's also gone, Justin Matters got the elbow too. Sharon Graham respected you, which may have helped get you the sack, I don't know, from that job. And Justin Dan's quickfire, number 10 or the Premier League title?
Well, first of all, Kevin, I thought you were going to ask about Sunderland's start of the season, which I think we can all recognise has been tremendous. But on the substantive issue, look, I mean, I think Peter did great work at DCIT. I saw his speech today. He was very clear on employment rights. I would ask anyone not to underestimate the absolute support across the cabinet for the New Deal for working people. We need to make sure that growth's going to be higher in the UK. We've got to address the malaise post-financial crisis, which has now run for many, many years. But that's got to be the way that people feel the benefit from, right? And look, of course I understand, I've dealt with businesses all the time on the level of change in the Employment Rights Bill, that aggregate impact. I understand the roadmap was there to show how the different stages of that would come into being. But, people tend not to oppose the specific measures in that. It's about understanding that proportionality, how we'll deliver it. So I believe Peter said very clearly he'll continue that work. And I think on the point of the unions, look, I come from the same place as you, Kevin, where the role of unions in kind of civic society and in the lives of working people and communities have played an incredibly positive role. I would always say I was the most pro-business person in the cabinet because that's what a business secretary should be. If you can do that and at the same time gain respect from general secretaries, work collectively, constructively with them, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's exactly what it's about. I mean, I've said a few times before, I felt in the Tory years, sometimes you had trade unions fighting more strongly for British industry than the Conservative government did. They were absolutely about jobs and industry. I think that's an agenda we can get behind and support, and I think that will continue. And all the appointments, not just Peter, but Chris, Blair, Kate, Chris Bryant at Trade, these are colleagues I would have total faith in taking this agenda forward.
What about the quickfire?
I mean, do I get to like play in the Sunderland team and win the Premier League title and maybe be the captain, Kevin, and kind of, you know, I mean, that would be pretty hard to resist.
Better than being Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, it would be more fun than being Prime Minister. I don't know whether you'd want to do it in that way, but yeah. I mean, I think I'd settle for, Kevin, a period where both the Labour Party and Sunderland were both doing well. So we haven't had that from the kind of Peter Reid, Tony Blair crossover. It might be time for the, you know, Keir Starmer, Régis Le Bris golden years.
Well, you can dream, I suppose. Thank you very much, Jonathan Reynolds, for coming in.
Thank you very much.